Perkins, The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman, narrated by Thomas Florio and Amanda Marr.
During the early years of the Cold War, American strategists were preoccupied with a question. How do you get rid of uncooperative rulers while keeping their countries and their resources under your control, without sending in the Marines? By the 1960s, they had an answer. They would use so-called economic hitmen, or EHMs, private sector contractors who did the dirty work necessary to keep countries aligned with the United States. John Perkins was one of those contractors. Recruited when he was still a young Peace Corps volunteer in Ecuador, he was molded into an EHM back in the U.S. These blinks both tell his story and detail how the EHM system has expanded since he left it in 1980. And after exploring how EHM activities have resulted in rising inequality, you'll find out what you can do about it.
Blink 1 of 8.
After World War II, the U.S. government was faced with a question. How can you advance your country's interests abroad without causing armed conflict and mass casualties? Looked at one way, this almost sounds like a call for global peace. But the U.S. government's answer was a little more nefarious than that. By the start of the Cold War in the 1960s, the U.S. had a persuasive way to back up its words: the threat of the atomic bomb. But although such a weapon is incredibly powerful, it's hardly practical for day-to-day negotiations. The U.S. needed a more effective way to encourage world leaders to promote U.S. commercial interests without risking more bloodshed. So it added a new tool to its arsenal: economic hitmen.
The key message here is, economic hitmen use debt as leverage to promote U.S. interests around the world.
An economic hitman, or EHM, is something like a secret agent. But unlike James Bond, an EHM mostly relies on the art of persuasion. Instead of gadgets, an EHM's tools are payoffs, extortion, and misleading economic reports, all with one main purpose: push countries to accept more and more economic aid from international organizations like the World Bank. Then use that debt to influence policy decisions, especially ones related to valuable natural resources like oil. When countries owe money, the U.S. can count on their loyalty, and that also benefits large U.S. corporations and their wealthy investors. With their doctored financial reports, EHMs convinced leaders that the programs they pushed would help the local economy flourish. If the leader wasn't aligned with U.S. interests or was unwilling to cooperate, EHMs would help instigate coups, followed by elections rigged to ensure a more agreeable replacement took over. EHMs also made use of extortion, threats, and whatever else was necessary to achieve U.S. political, economic, and military goals. But in 1953, a CIA agent named Kermit Roosevelt organized a coup in Iran. The goal was to regain unrestricted access to Iran's oil reserves. While the coup was successful, the U.S. realized it was playing a dangerous game. People like Roosevelt, who were organizing coups and pressuring leaders through debt, were representatives of the U.S. government. If they were found out, it would be a big problem. The solution? Funnel money to private sector companies, who would then hire and manage teams of EHMs around the world. If efforts went awry, they could only be traced back to these private corporations, and not the CIA or U.S. military.
Blink 2 of 8.
In 1968, the author John Perkins didn't know anything about the world of EHMs. Ready to finish his business administration degree at Boston University, the 23-year-old Perkins was looking for adventure in his life, and for a way to avoid the Vietnam War draft. He soon found a way to tick both boxes, turning down the offer of a desk job at the National Security Agency in favor of a more enticing opportunity: volunteering with the Peace Corps in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Perkins fully immersed himself in his Peace Corps duties. In the process, he learned about Ecuador's people, history, and economy. Partway through his stint, he received an unlikely visitor, a man named Einar Grieve. Grieve was vice president of Chastity Main Incorporated, or Main, an international engineering consultancy. He needed someone who knew the country, someone he could trust.
The key message here is Perkins started his EHM career working for a private consultancy.
Maine needed to assure its client, the World Bank, that it would be a wise investment to loan billions of dollars to Ecuador and its neighbors to fund some much-needed hydroelectric dams. Grieve asked Perkins to help. Over the following year, Perkins sent Grieve frequent reports analyzing Ecuador's economy. When he returned to Boston in 1971, Grieve offered him a job as an economic forecaster for Maine. Over time, Perkins noticed that while Maine was an engineering company, it didn't actually build anything. Instead, it played the middleman between governments and private companies. Over the next 10 years, Perkins wrote economic reports similar to those he'd written when he was in Ecuador. His job was to make massive loans seem like a good idea, loans that would leave countries deep in debt and vulnerable to U.S. influence. For example, Perkins spun data to convince Indonesia's leaders to accept billion-dollar loans for infrastructure projects and oil extraction. As was standard, the terms of the loans required them to hire American contractors, like Maine. Maine didn't receive money from the U.S. government directly, but it didn't need to. The terms of the loans guaranteed the company would get rich. In 1973, Perkins negotiated U.S. access to Saudi Arabia's oil reserves, brokering large-scale modernization of the country's infrastructure in return. Over the years, he witnessed coups, assassinations, money laundering, and corruption, all as a result of his EHM activities. Eventually, his conscience caught up to him. He quit Maine in 1980. But America's use of EHMs around the world was just getting started.
Blink 3 of 8.
By the mid-2000s, Ecuador had seen 8 different presidents in a decade. Each was toppled or assassinated and replaced with someone who prioritized U.S. interests. But in 2006, a promising new presidential candidate named Rafael Correa emerged. Correa vowed to take back control of Ecuador's natural resources. This and other of his campaign pledges proved immensely popular. He won 60% of the vote, and after taking office, he began following through. But there was one problem. His administration had inherited vast debts which would take years to pay off. If Correa wanted to continue tackling his bold agenda, he needed to make some difficult concessions.
The key message here is national debts forced Ecuador's new president to compromise.
Correa knew what he was up against. He'd read the first edition of Confessions of an Economic Hitman. He'd already been approached by EHMs, too, and was poised to resist their demands. So, when the International Monetary Fund told Correa that the only way out was to sell all of the petroleum under the Amazon rainforest to the hungry oil companies waiting in the wings, he refused to pay up. After all, earlier financing agreements had been signed by Ecuador's military dictators in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, all propped up by the CIA and pressured by EHMs. But then Correa went a step too far. He tried to renegotiate national oil contracts, which stipulated that Ecuador didn't actually own any of its oil and was only entitled to a share of the profits. When the EHMs failed to change his mind, they tried to oust him like the previous 8 presidents. In 2010, the Ecuadorian police, organized by EHMs and likely with help from the CIA, staged a coup. The military defended Correa, who survived and remained in office. But he found himself in a tight spot. If he acted too aggressively, he could still be replaced with another puppet. He'd have no chance to achieve his more feasible goals. As a result, Correa's policy decisions in the years to follow weren't as revolutionary as his campaign had led voters to expect. In 2011, he began auctioning off Ecuador's oil-rich rainforests to placate the EHMs and pay off the country's debts. Indigenous communities protested, and the demonstrations received enough media attention to deter any U.S. companies from showing up to bid on the land. The bad PR just wasn't worth it.
Blink 4 of 8.
What made the work of EHMs possible was corporatocracy, networks connecting corporations, banks, and governments. It was a powerful vehicle for corruption, and while it began in America, its tendrils gradually achieved global reach. This wasn't something that the average person was aware of. The influence of corporatocracy remained largely in the shadows. But in 2015, a scandal brought it into the light. Partly. That year, the U.S. Justice Department charged officials of FIFA, the international governing body of soccer, with a smorgasbord of corruption allegations. These included taking bribes, money laundering, and fraud, all of which were tools in the EHM repertoire. On the surface, the guilty pleas of FIFA officials represented a big victory for anti-corruption efforts. But while the defendants forfeited sums in the millions and a spotlight shone on their misdeeds, another, far larger scandal remained in the dark.
The key message here is, the 2015 FIFA corruption scandal distracted the public from a larger banking conspiracy.
As early as 2007, Barclays, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, the Royal Bank of Scotland, and UBS of Switzerland formed what some members called the cartel. The goal? To load their coffers through market manipulation. Through emails and secret chat rooms with names like the Mafia, these bankers coordinated in rigging the price of currencies on the foreign exchange market, known as Forex. In 2014, they got caught. The banks pleaded guilty and were fined nearly $6 billion, a lot of money for the average person. But for these banks, whose assets were in the hundreds of billions, it was a drop in the bucket. Nobody was arrested. So why was it so easy to follow the play-by-play of the FIFA scandal, even though the settlement was pennies on the dollar to the Forex lawsuits? Maybe it just makes for better television. Professional sports are more entertaining than global currency trading. The author has a different theory. Instead, he believes, there must have been a reason these banks' cartel schemes were allowed to go on for so long. Banks are part of the corporatocracy, and so can depend on lobbyists to influence the Justice Department. They have enough money and power to buy off elected officials and ensure that they don't get over-regulated. FIFA, on the other hand, isn't part of this club. So when both scandals surfaced within months of each other, it was clear which case would get more airtime. The Forex bankers walked away free, while FIFA officials were handcuffed for the world to see.
Blink 5 of 8.
The Forex scandal is only the tip of the corporocratic iceberg when it comes to corporate EHMs influencing law and order. The number and variety of EHMs have grown since Perkins' time, and today, many large corporations in the United States use them to achieve their goals. At home and abroad, EHMs have helped make wealthy people and businesses richer and the rest of the world poorer. A 2014 Oxfam report found that 1% of the global population owns nearly half of the world's wealth, and 70% of the world's population now lives in countries where economic inequality has increased over the previous 30 years. The U.S. is one of them. As global inequality continues to worsen, private banks have begun hiring EHMs too, and $100 billion corporations rely on EHMs to vouch for tax cuts in Washington.
The key message here is, EHMs also work for large banks and companies in the United States.
You're probably familiar with Boeing as an aircraft manufacturer, but the company also produces weapons. In fact, it's one of the 3 largest defense contractors in the world. Boeing employs a special breed of EHMs called Site Location Consultants, whose job is to pressure communities into granting Boeing tax breaks and loosening environmental regulations. If local and state governments don't meet their demands, Boeing threatens to take its business and thousands of jobs elsewhere. Boeing's consultants are rewarded handsomely, earning as much as 30% of the government subsidies they secure. Other household names receive substantial corporate welfare thanks to these site location consultants and other new types of EHM. According to a report by the National Policy Center Good Jobs First, from 2000 to 2015, the U.S. government gave subsidies of $60 million or more to 298 corporations, including Goldman Sachs and Monsanto. ExxonMobil, which made $41 billion in profit in 2011, received $119 million in state subsidies. Perhaps most striking is Walmart. A report by Americans for Tax Fairness found that this popular supermarket chain avoids paying billions in U.S. taxes by storing its assets, some $76 billion, in 15 overseas tax havens. Such a maneuver would be near impossible without the help of EHM methods. But as profits have increased, wages have remained low. Walmart employees rely on $6 billion a year in subsidized healthcare, public nutrition, and housing assistance programs. The owners of Walmart, the Walton family, are some of the richest people on the planet, and yet it's never enough. They still rely on EHMs to increase their fortune at the expense of others.
Blink 6 of 8.
The U.S. isn't alone in its use of EHMs. You might remember that after Ecuador's former president Rafael Correa took office, he refused to pay the millions of dollars in debt he'd inherited from past presidents. Consequently, Ecuador's credit rating plummeted. Correa approached Beijing, and China was only too happy to help, providing a $2 billion loan. Once Ecuador repaid these loans, its global credit standing was reinstated. But in the process, the country also became vulnerable to China and its own version of EHMs. By 2015, Ecuador was selling 55% of its oil to China and none to the U.S.
The key message here is China has developed its own EHMs.
Since the 90s, China has been taking notes on U.S. foreign policy tactics. With the help of its EHMs, China has relied on many of the same strategies, such as debt and fear, to increase its wealth and power. China appears to have learned from some of Washington's early mistakes. When offering loans, instead of pushing free trade agreements, it assures countries that its factories will be around for the long term. Unlike World Bank loans, which often come with a series of strict conditional requirements, China also doesn't appear to tack on such demands. But regardless of its improvements to the EHM system, the basis remains the same: exploit developing countries through debt and use that to accumulate capital and influence. Just as many countries fear the U.S., there's frequent talk within the U.S. of fearing China, its influence, and even its contributions to industrial pollution. American politicians and talking heads often repeat the question, how can we stop China? The author argues this is misguided, as the US and China are more closely intertwined than we might assume. For instance, much of the pollution China produces is for goods exported to the US. Chinese pollution is US pollution. People living in the United States make up 5% of the world population, yet consume 25% of the world's resources. China, whose citizens constitute 19% of the world's population, is trying to imitate this wasteful model. As other countries join in, it becomes clear that everyone, from the US to China, Brazil to India, has to participate in a more sustainable system. So instead of stopping China, we should focus on changing our mindsets and the way we consume products and information.
Blink 7 of 8.
The tools EHMs employ, threats, bribes, and deception, to name but a few, perpetuate a system of fear and debt around the world. The outcome is a form of predatory corporate capitalism that the author calls a death economy. Individuals and nations are moved to act out of fear or threats. In response to EHM threats of violence or further debt, countries like Ecuador and Iran are forced to ravish their natural resources to the detriment of their people and the environment. This is unsustainable. People around the world have been led to believe that this system serves everyone's interests. As long as the economy is growing, it must be good for all involved. As we've seen, this isn't the case. So, what can you do?
The key message here is, to transition from a death economy, we need to change our mindsets.
If you want to leave the status quo behind, you have to rethink the core tenets of the death economy and make a life economy your top priority. If a death economy is based on debt and threats of war, a life economy is quite the opposite, treating the environment with respect, empowering people to provide for themselves, developing sustainable, renewable energy, and creating community-oriented banking systems that don't profit from generations of debt. Instead of waiting for corporations or governments to fix the world's current problems, we can all take a stand and get to work creating a more just future. One small step is to shop and invest responsibly. Our current lifestyle encourages excessive consumption, so buy less, shop locally, and invest in ethical organizations. Engage with these businesses by email and hold them responsible for their actions. Let them know what you wish they would change. Another option is to pick a cause and regularly devote some time to it. You could try to change unacceptable practices in a corporation like Monsanto or Walmart, or support a non-governmental organization with your words and donations. Even better, join a movement demanding social, economic, or geopolitical reforms and become an active participant. In the political sphere, curb the mushrooming lobbyist trend in politics by fighting for campaign finance reform and champion political candidates who support real climate change regulations. Lastly, take time to learn about the goings-on of the world and speak out against injustices.
Blink 8 of 8.
Countless companies take advantage of the perks EHMs can deliver. Others might be more sympathetic to the dream of a life economy. Perhaps you're leading a business or are an entrepreneur aiming to mold your company to match your belief in an ethical world. You too can take action and make real, positive changes. Alternatively, if you're a concerned customer looking to hold your favorite companies accountable, these tips can serve to guide your demands for more equitable business practices.
The key message here is, business leaders can help transform the current death economy into a life economy.
To begin with, decide on your goals and values and incorporate them into your mission statement and marketing programs for all to see. If you believe in preserving the environment and in social harmony and justice for all members of the public, make that known. Tell your investors, executives, and employees why this is important to you and how this will benefit your company's long-term interests. Secondly, put your money where your mouth is. Words are cheap, but mean nothing if you don't incorporate them into your actual business practices. That means ensuring that any raw materials you use are sourced from recycled materials or sustainable suppliers who can demonstrate that the process doesn't harm animals or the environment. Every employee and stakeholder should know the source of your materials. Thirdly, don't be like Walmart. All employees should earn a fair living wage. Structure your salaries and bonuses to guarantee that differences in compensation fall within a reasonable range. For example, you could create a rule that the highest paid employee doesn't make more than 3 times the rate of the lowest paid employee. Last but not least, commit to making your company a diverse and inclusive place at every level. This goes for the people you hire, the suppliers you contract, and the organizations you associate with. Otherwise, your business practices might just slide into a monocultural pit, rarely a recipe for success. With all of these actions you can take as an individual or organization, transitioning to a life economy seems like a daunting task. Start small, and as you're joined by other like-minded life economists, keep up the momentum.
You've just listened to our blinks to The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins.
The key message in these blinks is, after World War II, the United States developed a new way to achieve its goals abroad: economic hitmen. These EHMs pushed developing countries to take on more debt and used that as leverage to influence policy decisions and demand loyalty. In recent decades, these tactics have made their way back to the US in different forms, from private banks to political lobbyists. Other countries, like China, have started using the same strategies. To combat this rise in corruption around the planet, we need to take action to transform the world into a life economy, one that favors individuals and the environment over wealthy corporations. And here's some actionable advice. Live locally. Part of being an active member of your community means minimizing the effects of globalization on local economies and communities. Instead of putting your money in one of the trillion-dollar banks from the Forex scandal, choose a local bank that invests back into your town. Rather than buying vegetables from halfway across the world, go for locally grown produce whenever possible. Avoid bottled water and unnecessary plastic bags, and use environmentally friendly, reusable materials to lower your ecological footprint.
Got feedback? We would love to hear what you think about our content. Just drop an email to remember@blinkist.com with The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman as the subject line and share your thoughts.